So exploring some of these questions in relation to more recent turns in scholarship brings us into conversation with critical citizenship scholarship and critical border studies in some interesting ways. An important point to remind ourselves here is about in critical citizenship studies and critical border studies, focusing on the radical potential of immigrant protest that resides in the ways in which people organise and act despite their lack of access to the rights and protections of citizenship. Indeed, given the increasingly controlling and excluding function of many statist forms of citizenship, migrant activists and scholars have increasingly adopted a language of local, transnational and global citizenship. So this offers us another way of still troubling, unsettling those binaries that we've been looking at thus far. The argument is that the very assertion of rights is in itself an act of citizenship. Advancing the concept of acts of citizenship in the work of Essen, Attach, Rigiel and Sterl shift the emphasis to active, creative and innovative deeds, so concrete practices of individual and collective engagement, which they talk about rupturing the normality of everyday life, challenging the existing social and political order, and also crossing the boundaries of states and nations. This is, I suppose, what one would describe as a leftist view, but this latter substantive form of citizenship is in fact the condition which gives individuals the possibilities to constitute themselves as true democratic citizens who, as activists and agents who are pushing against, demand to be heard in public and who may provoke public dialogues on a wide range of issues. And we can see parallels and echoes and resonances with the work of Sivanandan and with the reconfiguring proposed by Daytona and Moreo. A contentious politics perspective then means that individuals and groups organise and ally with varying degrees of formality to push for social changes, and that offer or advance alternative imaginaries, so alternative ways of imagining how things could be. It necessarily means engaging with and drawing on individuals and other organisations with distinct positionalities. And the spaces that become available to do this really does matter. Citizenship thus becomes a practice that disrupts social historical patterns in that subjects constitute themselves as citizenships, and as so, an act of citizenship contests the meaning of citizenship itself. So contentious politics provides one way to explore the dynamics of movements themselves alongside wider contextual factors. So focusing on interactions between protesters and state actors, and focusing on internal dynamics. And again, here I think there are very strong resonances with the work of Sivanandan. And if you're interested in exploring further the work of Nina Verbner, looking at Black leadership in the 1980s. But I think there is an interesting layer here that brings us back to this idea of organic communities of resistance, that when acting together, avoid the pitfalls of stifled dissent. And really new spaces of citizenship emerge, and they reflect spatial strategies of struggle. Just to draw on some examples to illustrate this point, if we shift our focus away from the refugee welcome solidarity movement for the moment to the collective actions by refugees, migrants and solidarity groups brought together, struggling for citizenship and social rights, as well as the right to move and to stay, we can highlight different aspects of protest activities and mobilisations. And this does make us question those sites and locations of different forms of protest, occupation, and whether this matters. How do the different sites affect outcomes of struggles, the types of demands being made, the audiences who hear those demands, and whether they can be negotiated or revisited, How is space claimed and how is space used? So, for example, if we look at what happened in the summer of 2015, when refugees by their thousands made their way on foot, marching to different European countries, they became political subjects and gained visibility by enacting those claims and sharing their stories. But in discussing the collective actions around the events of summer 2015 and since, public discourse and research analyses have tended to focus on welcome initiatives and counter movements that take action against refugees. But in doing so, they ignore some of those essential aspects of collective action around migrants and refugees, and protest activities by solidarity groups and migrants, as well as refugee mobilisations for self-organised action. So the contentious space there is one that actually brings together interactions between protesters and state actors, but also focuses on what is happening within those campaigns. Another example is the anti-deportation campaigns that we've seen increasingly built upon personal connections between protest activists and individuals. That is, people who are affected by deportations as an important precondition for the success of campaigns. Consequently, rather than challenging migration policy or laws, these protests and mobilisations aims at preventing the removal of individuals from their local and social embeddedness. And this reflects what Don Flynn was talking about, the environment as an atmosphere we walk across, and that when this becomes a hostile environment, it has a rippling effect, and it affects us all. And when it affects us all, we have a collective responsibility to try and be transformative and act for change. A last example just to flag up here is the work of Maurice Sterl, and this is on the reading list, that looks at the network Watch the Med Alarm Phone, which engages with refugees in emergency situations in the Mediterranean Sea by providing a hotline. These are activists who also advocate for freedom of movement, and they understand that life-saving emergency aid is not only about saving lives, but is a political act directed against Fortress Europe, its exclusionary border regime, and what they describe the production of Mediterranean death zones. So they are engaging in new modalities of collective struggle in some really quite unlikely spaces. So if we consider the spatial dimension of political mobilisation of refugees, asylum regime entails multiple restrictions that complicate the social participation of asylum seekers and refugees in host societies in general. And as we saw in last week's session, this suggests a way of mapping this out geographically, so potentially a geography of contention that shapes contemporary protest movements, and some of the case studies you're going to be looking at will explore this. For example, when asylum seekers are moved from socially and spatially isolated locations into the centre of a city, these movements generate new modes of mobilisation and collective action. But on the other hand, the change of a location comes with an important change in alliances, networks, and social ties. And this is really what I think we're getting at here with this way of conceptualising this as geographies of contention. What I'd like you to do here is pause and watch this short clip. It'll be a story that some of you will be familiar with. Cédric Hérault, a French farmer who supported and housed African refugees in southern France. Many saw him as a good Samaritan. Others denounced him as a leader of a band of smugglers. So watch this clip and think about these reflections. Are these acts of contentious politics? And also be thinking about the criminalisation of resistance, which is something I've not touched upon, but is important, and perhaps reflect on other cases you've come across. This next slide actually outlines what I'd like you to prepare for the class, and it's going to be a mini case study. You've been allocated case studies, and these will be accessible on Moodle. And I'd like you each to read your case study and think about the theoretical and conceptual ideas discussed thus far. And here's some guidance for you to plan out how you will present that to your peers in class, so to each other. So think through some of these questions, and we'll be discussing this together in class. This will also allow us a way to share our learning as you're all reading different case studies. So just some final thoughts as we conclude this session. We can see that resistance is really bound up in the ways in which people understand their capacity to make or oppose changes. Activism, as has been suggested, can be visible and audible. It can be quiet and loud. It can be public and it can be private. And acts of resistance can be assessed in terms of how they operate to generate, build or challenge dominant discourses about migration and migrants, and be used to explore ways of the inequalities are produced and reproduced, and also, importantly, challenge denials of these inequalities and thus raise awareness. Resistance is also about creating, asserting, or arresting change, so putting a stop to proposed changes. It can be about consolidating different ways of living. It might be stopping certain events. But while resistance occurs at a personal level, it is arguably its most effective when it resonates with a community of resistors. And this is really, I think, what Scott and particularly Sivanandan are getting at. So some key points here about this territory between defiance and compliance, the fluid social dynamics, and the key characteristics that can help us conceptualize what we understand by resistance. And I suppose a final question to end on. What, if anything, might be our role as researchers in thinking through the concepts we use to explain these phenomena? So reflexively turning that back onto us and thinking where we position ourselves and the work that we do and how that in itself may produce or reproduce the very inequalities we're seeking to challenge.